Good morning, everyone. So wonderful to have everyone with us today. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and I am thrilled, thank you. I'm thrilled to welcome all of you, whether you're joining us in person or online, to Radcliffe Day 2024. Each year, Radcliffe Day is an opportunity to gather our community and recognize an individual whose life and work reflects the Institute's ideals of excellence and impact, ideals we carry forward from our proud history as Radcliffe College. Today, we're honoring the path-breaking Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Sonia Sotomayor. We're honoring Justice Sotomayor for embodying and advancing equality and opportunity throughout her life's work as a litigator and a judge. Later today, Justice Sotomayor will engage in a conversation with my esteemed colleague, 300th anniversary university professor Martha Minow. I'll introduce them more fully this afternoon. We'll also hear a testimonial from Rita Moreno. And I'll conclude the festivities by formally presenting the Radcliffe Medal to Justice Sotomayor. But first, in keeping with Radcliffe Day tradition, we'll begin with an expert panel discussion on a subject that resonates with our honorees' life and work. Today, our panelists will consider the long arc of equality and justice in America. Now, the panel takes its inspiration from a quotation famously referenced by Martin Luther King Jr., which observes, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." As a leader of the American Civil Rights movement, King himself was a central figure in bending that moral arc here in our country. In the long struggle to defeat segregation, King called upon the nation to make real the promises of democracy by living up to the principles enshrined in its founding documents, including liberty and equal protection of the laws. These concepts, captured in texts like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, remain central to American identity and governance. Yet, the soaring rhetoric of these documents has long existed in tension with the realities of American life. The gap between principles and practice prompted King and generations of Americans to advocate for change and push the nation to realize its foundational tenets. In the nearly 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the nation has made great progress towards fulfilling the promise of equality embodied in American law. Nevertheless, much work remains as we strive to uphold our highest ideals. This morning, our panel will consider where we stand today in the nation's long pursuit of equal opportunity, and it will explore how to work together toward a future that advances equal rights for all. For as Justice Sotomayor herself recently observed, change never happens on its own. Change happens because people care about moving the arc of the universe towards justice. And now I'm pleased to introduce Melissa Murray, who will moderate this morning's panel. Melissa is the Frederick I and Grace Stokes Professor of Law at New York University School of Law, and she's an award-winning scholar of family law, constitutional law, and reproductive justice and rights. Her publications have appeared in numerous prestigious law journals as well as popular media outlets. She's co-author of Cases on Reproductive Rights and Justice, as well as co-editor of Reproductive Rights and Justice Stories. In addition, she is a legal analyst for MSNBC and co-hosts the podcast Strict Scrutiny, which examines the biggest legal questions facing our country. She is a graduate of Yale Law School and clerked for Justice Sotomayor on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. Melissa will introduce our panelists in just a moment, so let me express my gratitude to her and to each of our esteemed guests for sharing their expertise and perspectives with us today. Thank you so much. And now please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here for Radcliffe Day. Thank you, Dean Brown-Nagin, for those lovely introductory remarks. Appreciate them. And many thanks to the staff of the Radcliffe Institute, including Becky Wasserman and Jessica Vickland, who have brought us together, have managed this entire event with military precision. No one could do it better. Thank you so much. As Dean Brown-Nagin said, I clerked for Justice Sotomayor in the 2003-2004 term when she was a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And there are very few occasions where I have the opportunity to express my gratitude for the opportunity that she gave me, and this is one of them. So if you will indulge me, I would like to take a moment to do that. Justice Sotomayor, I cannot think of a more deserving honoree for the Radcliffe Medal. The year that I spent working with you was one of the most formative years of my career. I saw every day how important it was to you that the law be applied fairly and consistently, and that each opinion be written so that every litigant, regardless of whether or not they prevailed, understood that their cause and their claim had been heard. It has been a joy to watch you as a justice of the United States Supreme Court and to watch you bring that same dedication to translating the law into the lives of ordinary people to the entire country. I am so grateful for your example in my life and for your example for our entire country. Congratulations on this terrific and absolutely well-deserved honor. The title of this panel is The Long Arc of Equality and Justice in America, and as Dean Brown-Nagin said, the title recalls Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous invocation that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That idea suggests that the moral universe is constantly moving towards some idea of progress. It is a narrative of American progress, that we are constantly moving and indeed bending toward a more perfect union and a more perfect instantiation of democracy. But is that true? In our own history, the project of perfecting democracy has not been one of consistent forward progress. but rather has been a series of oscillating moves toward and against this kind of progress. The American Revolution was followed by almost a century of enslavement. The American Civil War formally ended slavery, but Reconstruction was inevitably followed by the backlash of redemption and Jim Crow. And today, nearly 2 generations after the forward progress of the civil rights movement, many believe that the United States is regressing on its commitment to civil rights, that we are riven by partisan politics and divided on the basic tenets of what it means to be a democracy. Indeed, in this moment, the very idea of democracy seems fragile and precarious. When Dr. King spoke of bending toward justice, the democracy he envisioned was one marked by pluralism. In his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King famously conjured the image of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy. But in its earliest conceptions, democracy was hardly plural in the manner that Dr. King contemplated. In its origins in Athens, democracy was not marked by pluralism and heterogeneity, but rather by a stubborn homogeneity. The ancient Athenians may have differed as to their views of moral philosophy, but they shared a common identity, a common nationality, and a vision of the good life. In many ways, contemporary America lacks some of those common underpinnings that allowed democracy to flourish in Athens. Not only are we a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith society, but many Americans believe that we increasingly lack a shared vernacular about what it means to even be an American. And this shows up in a lack of trust for our common core institutions, like Congress and the courts. It also shows up in our pitched culture war battles, which is why today's conversation is so critically important. Today, with our esteemed panel, we are going to talk about how we can forge ahead together at a time when so many believe that we have never been further apart. Joining me to discuss these important topics is a terrific panel. To my immediate left is Nina Perales, the Vice President of Litigation for MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. To Nina's left is Mary Bonato, the Senior Director of Civil Rights and Legal Strategies at GLAAD. To Mary's left is Adam Liptak, who covers the United States Supreme Court for the New York Times. And to Adam's left is Jerome Foster II, an activist, social entrepreneur, and impact consultant and speaker who works on issues of climate justice and environmental justice. So to kick things off, I'm going to pose a question to each of our panelists. And I want to emphasize for our panelists, this should be a conversation, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, intergenerational conversation. So please feel free to jump in as you see fit. But the first question to you, Nina, given how plural our society is, what does it mean to work for and indeed to advocate on behalf of an identity-based advocacy group, the kind of advocacy group that is part of the vestige of the civil rights movement? MALDEF is one of the largest groups that advocates on behalf of Latinx Americans in the United States. Are we at a point where identity-based advocacy is sort of going by the wayside in favor of broader coalitions, or is there still a place for identity-based advocacy and organizing in our country?
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you for including me in the panel here today. It's a tremendous privilege and honor. So my answer to the question is yes, there is still a role. And you might say, well, that's because you work for MALDEF. It's a very traditional civil rights organization that works through the courts. Also, we think of as sort of inherently conservative. But the answer is still yes, although maybe not the way we've envisioned pluralism before. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Latino perspective. You may have read in the news that the Census Bureau is reorganizing questions about race and ethnicity in response to the way that Latinos think of themselves. And sort of the numbers behind that are in our most recent census in 2020, over 60 million Latinos were recorded in the United States. And all of them were confronted with questions about their race, but very traditional race categories: white, Black, Asian, Native American. Well, 3/4 of that really large Latino population marked either some other race, or they marked a race and then filled something sort of free response in under some other race. So 3/4 of Latinos who were recorded by the census did not see themselves fitting into the traditional race categories that were offered on the census. And when you have 45 million people in the United States who don't see themselves fitting in to traditional race categories, that was certainly an inspiration for the census to think about organizing the questions a little bit differently. So people will still be presented with lots of options on the census, but the organization will be somewhat different. So I think that the idea of race or racial identity is still very salient in the Latino community, but maybe with a slight twist off of what's been in the past. The other small point that I wanted to make is that in some ways, it's not us that's necessarily pushing racial identity, but we're responding to efforts around racial identity. I live and work in Texas, where we're dealing with classroom censorship laws and laws that prevent public universities from having DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. In the Texas legislature, these laws are justified by having to protect white people from perhaps what is assumed to be a somewhat painful response to learning about history. It's interesting because the idea is that white people are perhaps just too vulnerable to hear about things like discrimination. It's not my view, certainly, but it's the idea that we have to protect white folks from these pains and these indignities, right? So in some ways, the racial identity activism is coming at us, and we have to respond. We have to play defense. So finally, in terms of our more pluralistic society, I'm extremely hopeful. The Latino community is young. We are playing catch up on educational achievement, it's true. But as voters, I think we're going to have a very strong influence on how society operates. And there can be efforts, to say, like in the affirmative action decision, that, well, who knows what a Latino is? Well, I can tell you Latinos know who Latinos are. It's not a made-up category, right? And yes, there can be efforts to make things more difficult at the ballot box, but ultimately, I think those are last gasp efforts, and that our more pluralistic society is on its way. So I'm very hopeful.
Okay, a very hopeful message. So very hopeful message from Nina. Mary, you've had lots to hope for, and you've been successful in your hopes over the last couple of years. You have helped lead a legal movement that has seen some losses, but also enormous, enormous wins in a very short period of time. And in fact, some people might even say that your historic win in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, this was the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage throughout the country, was sort of a resting place for you, and that once marriage equality was achieved, the cause of gay equality had been realized. What lies ahead, and is that too facile and simplistic in thinking about what it means to lead an organization that is deeply intersectional in terms of identity and encompasses a wide range of Americans from all different stripes of life?
That's quite a question, Melissa. And I also just want to thank you and the panel and Radcliffe Institute for inviting me here today. I am truly honored. I want to just build for a second off of some of what Nina had to say, which I agree with. I don't think identity-based movements are going away because identity remains important to people as a source of inspiration, joy, connection across generations, across communities, across geography. It's salient. And it's not only salient in terms of being inspirational to people, but as Nina was also mentioning, people become wedge issues rather than people. And that hasn't stopped at all. And you do need organizations who, with expertise and a long-term commitment, not just based on the fashion of the day, but who are willing to make a long-term commitment to think about strategies in the short and long terms so that people can live their lives and have freedoms and opportunities and safety and be able to prosper in their lives. And you need people paying attention to that because it honestly does feel often like, where is all this coming from? Although we can all talk about that. About trying to get in, that there's a zero-sum mentality about if you get ahead, I get behind. So I want to say that I think organizations like ours are necessary, and I want to talk, since I've been at GLAAD for over 3 decades now, I have really seen a difference from when I was coming up, in college, law school, and so on, and then eventually to GLAAD, in terms of LGBTQ people's, how they see themselves as like citizens or as belonging in this nation's fundamental promises about liberty and equality for all. Because, you think about HIV and the AIDS crisis where people were just ignored for years. And the action that it took, and that action ultimately also resulting in law. And you think about all of the ways in which the kinds of struggles we've had to make around non-discrimination, around healthcare, currently around healthcare for trans people, so many issues that now, and with marriage for sure, people now see themselves more in the Constitution. They feel like we all have a claim on this. And there is not as much exceptionalism as, yeah, that's the rule for everybody else, but not for you. And that matters, going to the point about pluralism and about democracy, to say when you see yourself as part of these promises, you notice when you're excluded. And, I think about Dobbs and the assertion that this was all going to be about democracy and it was going to be handled at the local level. Well, I think many of us felt like, okay, let's go. Let's go and think about what's happened since then. I know bad things, but also really incredible things, because again, people had a sense that we were being pushed out of the Constitution, fundamental right was being reversed, and that was wrong, and we had to change it. And I see that in LGBTQ communities, I see that across the board. And is this a short-term solution? Absolutely not. But is it essential? Yes. And the one last thing I want to say about identity, if I have 1 second here, do I? Okay. So I know we're in an academic institution, and I also just attended a bunch of graduations from 2 graduations from our daughters. And I was really just struck about how so much of the academic ethos is around curiosity and learning. And meaning learning about things you don't know about, and knowing that, you can read literature so many different ways and make arguments about it, or make arguments from history that you can see many different ways. And one of the things I feel that is super important that's connected to identity is sort of getting beyond sometimes the external only identity to sort of actually talk to people and listen more and share more about where you agree, where you disagree, because you're going to find, I think, and we have found and had to find in our own work, ways to make some kind of agreement, find some kind of common ground on something that would allow you to move forward rather than remain in stasis. And I see that as connected to identity only in the sense that I don't want us to be superficial, I want us to be curious all the time. And of course, acknowledge disagreements, but try to find those places where we can make common cause with people and move forward.
Adam, you cover the United States Supreme Court for the New York Times, and sometimes that feels a little bit like being in the upside down, as it were. I wanted to flag a few things for you. Thank you. Right now, Adam, the Supreme Court seems to be in a precarious position. For many years, many Americans understood the court to be an engine in moving us toward that justice, the arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. And I think they have in mind the Warren Court and the famed decisions of the 1960s. Now, more and more Americans, according to polling, seem to be losing faith with the court based on a series of decisions that feel out of step with these essential commitments to equality and justice. At this moment, is the court a vehicle in that effort to bend toward justice, or is it an impediment?
So I think the short answer is the latter. In the following sense, the court over history, with the exception of the Warren Court, has generally been a conservative institution, and it's not what the American people have looked to make advances toward equality. But in the Warren Court era, and then notably while Justice Kennedy was on the court did move in the direction of protecting the rights of black men and then women and then gay people. And Mary's groundbreaking work, and 2 decades ago, the Supreme Judicial Court decision under Margie Marshall's leadership established a right to same-sex marriage that gradually took hold at the US Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision, and partly because the courts were leading public opinion, but partly because they were understanding that that's where the country was going anyway. The courts established this great advance in civil rights. Now, as a consequence of a lot of politics and some shenanigans in the Senate, we have a court with a 6-3 majority that, for the first time, eliminated a constitutional right. And in that decision, in the Dobbs decision, at least in Justice Clarence Thomas's concurrence, has made noises about rolling back established constitutional rights. You would think that whatever else could be said about the court, that it ought to be a one-way ratchet. As equality is increased, it should no longer be under threat. But to hear Justice Thomas tell it, the rights to contraception, to same-sex intimacy, to same-sex marriage are subject to the same kind of analysis as the right to abortion was in the Dobbs decision. And then I'll say one more thing, that the court's understanding of religious rights is turning into a vehicle to undermine some of these same rights we've been talking about. So the current Supreme Court, from the perspective of progressives, is not a pretty picture.
So Jerome, you were unusual on this panel, and I don't mean your relative youth. I mean that you are not a lawyer, and this is a panel mostly of lawyers, and that's by design. We've all talked about the role of the law in moving toward justice, but what is so interesting about the work of many of our young people in moving toward justice is that they are working outside of law. Right? They don't necessarily rely on the courts. They're doing grassroots organizing. They're doing bottom-up movements. Can you talk a little bit about how your movements have come together, why they have avoided law as a principal mechanism for advancing their goals, and if there is any interest in engaging law and policy going forward, and if so, how?
Absolutely, and I thank you for that question. And I recognize I'm one of the only non-lawyers here, and it was really interesting to be.
Thank you for not pointing out that we're also older. It's okay.
Yeah, but to your point, there's so much organizing around young people, which we were able to capture everyone's attention for climate justice specifically, for gun violence, and so many different issues that I think it shows that we do sometimes really rely on the power of the court, specifically within the Juliana versus United States court case, in which young people are demanding the US government to kind of step up and to recognize the severity of climate change and their responsibility to take action on behalf of it. But I think in general, a lot of young people, we really see our lever of change is in culture, and that we're able to change people's perceptions about what is morally just. And a key example of that is the fact that 5 years ago, when I was organizing and trying to get people to understand what climate change is, I was reaching out to a journalist, and I was saying, well, are you going to cover the climate march we're doing in Washington, D.C.? We're trying to get 10,000 people out. And the journalist said, we already covered climate change this year. Why would we cover it again? And now, 5 years later, climate change is at the center of every conversation, and it really is the pinnacle of, because young people change the culture to understand that we must act on climate. And I think another lever that we're pushing for now is looking to politics, but not specifically law, but around the legislation, and really making sure that elected officials know that they may have position, but that people have the power. And it goes back to decades of action where we saw that even like in the Montgomery bus boycotts, like the bus driver may have had position, but Rosa Parks had the power. And as young people, we're coming together and saying, like, you have to really have a moral awakening where there's a sense of clarity, there's a sense of purpose to you being in office and using the position you have for actual good. And against the kind of fabric of today where we're seeing so many regressing societal foundations, we're seeing that we nonetheless are still out in the streets, still organizing, and that the law is responding in a way where it is pushing us away. So it's further making us alienated from the fact that we feel a part of our democracy in a way. Like, we were able to get, from the climate strikes, we're able to get 1 in every 10 young people out in the streets. And now 87% of the world knows about climate change and knows about the urgency of it. And from that, we're understanding, well, what does that action get us? What legislation, what law, what are people in power going to do about it? And what's happening is that we're falling into a sense of despair. Because if there is no impact, there is no democracy in which where people can feel like their voice is being heard in a really substantive way, then people kind of tune out. And we're seeing that now in a lot of young people. We're saying, either we're gonna vote and like try to choose the lesser of two evils, or we're not gonna vote at all. But that shouldn't be the choice of an entire generation not feeling like they're reflected in the political system.
So can I come? You've said 4 or 5 really important things that I think are worth surfacing for the panel's discussion. This sense of disaffection that young people have, and again, the whole idea of young people, I think, is actually quite broad. The oldest millennials are 43, and honestly, right now, that does seem young to me. And then, of course, there are folks your age who are in their 20s. There's still this sense of profound disaffection that if you go out, if you vote like we've been telling you to do, your vote actually doesn't translate into meaningful gains in the policy areas that you're trying to change. Is that a law question? And I'm saying this because, again, I focus on the Supreme Court, and sometimes every hammer has a nail, and the Supreme Court is my nail. We have made it harder for the individual to translate their interests into the apparatus of democracy. The Supreme Court has blessed partisan gerrymandering by saying that there is no role for the federal courts to play. Yesterday, a decision was announced by the court in Alexander versus NAACP of South Carolina that makes it harder for litigants to challenge racial gerrymanders. And in a stunning, perhaps even jarring concurrence, Justice Thomas suggested that racial gerrymandering might also be considered a non-justiciable political question for which there is no role for the federal courts to play. In a climate where the landscape of democracy has been profoundly distorted by gerrymandering, by campaign finance, by voter suppression. What is the engine to manifest all of the energy that your generation is bringing to these issues?
I think that the kind of really key way in which we are able to impact law is by us showing up. And it's really crucial that, in not just showing up, that we have really key individuals that we're targeting. And I feel like a lot of us, for young people, we have seen a lot of coalitions form around the fact that a lot of these different issues aren't kind of as separated as the narrative says, and that we can see that civil rights are human rights and human rights are environmental rights and so on and so forth. And that conversation and that language allows us to create legal arguments in which we're able to say that you have, for so many decades, known about the climate crisis since the 1970s, and that you did not act in a way that you should have. And for us, it is showing that, especially in the case of so many societal issues, that communities have been left behind. So if you go to those communities and look at the kind of law aspect of it, you're seeing that, and there's kind of close data metrics where you see tree equity, for example, follows the disparity of race and inequality at a metric of 90%, where if a community has less tree equity, they're more than likely to be a community of color. And by using those kind of proxies, you're able to see that, well, this isn't just a kind of happenstance. This is a systemic issue which needs systemic changes. That is really crucial within law, is to create those standards and foundations so that we're able to move forward and be able to have a kind of democracy where we're seeing the judicial branch really stand up for the generation that is to come. As you talked about, you talked about how in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the Supreme Court understood that the population is changing. Our moral compass is understanding that everyone deserves an equal right to clean air, clean water, and so many different things that should be foundational, but are being stripped away. And right now, the court has to recognize that they're sitting on a sense of ticking time bomb, where like our generation will either continue to be unheard and will continue to vote them out, or we'll continue to place demands for them to retire, and we'll continue to be even more aggressive about how we must be heard, because we can't go decades upon decades without really seeing ourselves in so many communities really reflected in a lot of the democratic institutions. And I think one thing that has been so effective for my generation and the attitude that we take is that we're saying that our final response to injustice will not be despair. It will not be kind of laying down flat, accepting the fate of our future, while politicians kind of create the laws that will predominantly affect us. Because I'll be here for another 90 years, is seeing the impacts. And yeah.
It's so refreshing to hear from a different generation than ours. And it makes me think that we find ourselves in a position where we're ruled by a gerontocracy.
Yes.
By presidential candidates, by the Senate is made up of largely incredibly old people, and it might be time to let a new generation make some points.
If you're a parent of a teenager, you know that kind of generational change is already happening in your home. Nina, Mary, one of the things that Jerome has said that I think is really interesting is the need to be responsive to various communities who have been underserved by the law, by policy. And advocacy-based groups over the years, certainly from the point of the civil rights movement forward, have been criticized for really focusing on the advocacy without necessarily thinking about whether the impact litigation that they are bringing serves the needs and the desires of the communities they represent. In what ways have your organizations changed or modified your approaches in order to be more sensitive to these grassroots community concerns? Either.
Shall I start?
Sure.
I really appreciate the question and loved what you had to say, because I think one of the reasons that my organization remains vital and forward-thinking is because we have found a way to become an intergenerational organization where a lot of people have a voice, and it's, sometimes a little uncomfortable, but so productive to be challenged. So I appreciate that. That is one thing that I would say. The other thing is just thinking about the clarity. I have a lot of clarity about principles, but I also really feel that when I talk to people from other younger generations too, that clarity and the demand for action. And that has really, over the years, helped to move us, not only, like we do impact litigation, but we've been working so strategically, we hope, with partners, broad partners in many states and at the federal level as well, on legislation. And you think about any issue, whether it's climate, parentage, shield laws so that providers can provide reproductive or transgender medical care and not get hauled into court somewhere. Like, there's so many ways to proceed, and it's really enriched our movement. It's made more people feel like they belong. It's gotten people more active. The real buzzkill is the Supreme Court, no doubt about it, if I can just say that. Because we might do so much on a state level, and there is so much to be done on a state level, but then there's this thing called federal supremacy, and sometimes the Supreme Court can just really choke off a productive course of action. But at the same time, there is no reason not to engage, in my view, locally, talk to people, find that common ground where you agree. With legislation, it can be really painful if you don't get exactly what you want, but it's also true, I don't know, I'm probably sounding generational saying this, like sometimes 90% or 85% is better than 0%. And I personally prefer to think about bills, as long as they're productive and not harmful, as a platform for going forward, not backward. Concede no ground, but how do you make as much gain as you can? So I appreciate what you're saying, and I hear you about needing to think about policy and keep people really active and engaged. And that's one of the things that gives me hope, and I think also just keeps me relevant in a good way. And I just do love being able to share ideas and strategies, because sometimes I hear what people have to say and have a reaction. They hear what I have to say and they're like, okay, I didn't think about that before. So that's what you want. You want to pull all of this together. And I hope that we can do that across all movements.
I'm not sure I can say it any better than Mary did, but I will chime in that MALDEF recognizes, and we've been coming along in terms of how our younger community members think of themselves, right? We still work with people who are in their 60s and 70s who share in common with others, having gone to a segregated school, having had, not voted because their parents didn't vote because of the poll tax. So that is part of our constituency, and part of all of our constituencies. But some of our younger folks in the community may have, obviously, a different personal experience, but they also think of themselves more holistically in terms of their identity, right? It's not just I'm Mexican American. It is I'm a Latina and I have a uterus, right? And that crosses issues. Or I am a gay Latino man, and that crosses issues. So in some ways, our young folks are a lot more holistic in the way they think of themselves and they think of their identity. I also have, I'm pushing my third kid up into her 20s. She turns 20 this summer.
You survived.
Yes, and in part because of some historical quirks in Texas, that we didn't have four-year institutions in Texas south of Austin for many years, because the bottom part of the state was majority Latino. There was litigation, which the young folks don't remember. And now we have a four-year institution in San Antonio. So in my home, I don't have my children with me, but I have nieces with me who have come up from the Rio Grande Valley to go to school. And my job is to create these amazing Latina women as they make their way through college and out into the world. I do try to engage them in conversations about participation and political participation, because that's our job right now, is to get folks voting, to get folks participating, get folks advocating. And not to do it top down, right? But to help them flourish into these amazing folks.
Nina, is it harder to get them to engage on the question of voting when it feels like your vote may not actually translate into successful policies?
Yes.
Or policies that you want?
Oh, yeah. And everything that Jerome said is reflected back to me by my three kids and then my nieces. We're working on the third niece right now. And there's very much that sense of it. But then also I remember in 2018, the young folks in Texas were very excited about this guy named Beto O'Rourke out of El Paso, and he came within, I believe, 2 percentage points of unseating our Senator Ted Cruz. It was a big surprise. It was largely fueled by turnout in the young community. I asked one of my nieces, you know he's a white guy, right? And she was like, we don't care. He's very exciting. She says, I see him all over my social media pages. And so I think there's sort of perhaps an ebb and flow with respect to enthusiasm.
I mean, that's sort of like a similar kind of moment as we saw in 2008 with Barack Obama. Like, he doesn't look like me, but I'm excited by him. So, maybe part of this is having young people see candidates that they're particularly excited about. And this goes to your point, Adam, about our gerontocracy. Harder to do that when those running don't look like the young people who want to be represented. So, Adam, we're talking, I guess, in the vein of popular constitutionalism, how to translate the Constitution, its promises, into a vernacular that people on the ground can see themselves in, can actualize, and manifest into policies that resonate with them. Is there a role for the Supreme Court or the various blocks on the court to play in facilitating that kind of popular constitutionalism?
Absolutely. The Supreme Court, of course, decides particular disputes, and it announces broad legal principles, but it also has a kind of teaching role, a didactic role, an agenda-setting role. So I think back a couple terms ago, the case of the, the cursing cheerleader. And the court, through Justice Breyer, sort of told the nation that part of the work of the First Amendment is to make sure that people can speak freely and that schools need to live and demonstrate their First Amendment commitments. And that kind of getting into the national conversation, whatever the outcome of the particular case is, can be quite valuable, and not only in majority opinions. Justice Sotomayor, for instance, routinely writes separately, often in statements respecting or dissenting from the denial of certiorari about criminal justice matters. And that shines a bright spotlight on flaws in the criminal justice system. So there's a lot that goes on at the court that is above, sideways to, orthogonal to the actual dispute being resolved, that plays a role in what the country thinks, believes, considers.
So you mentioned the First Amendment, Adam, and again, this is a conversation for the whole panel and something I hope you all will engage with. Nina mentioned the fact of curricular and book bans throughout the country, which is deeply, deeply concerning, and not just a First Amendment issue, but generally an access to knowledge question. And the desire to limit these curricular materials seems, as Nina suggested, to be animated by a desire to spare certain constituencies the discomfort of having to wrestle with a complicated past. Jerome, in your own schooling, has it been useful to wrestle? Have you wrestled with these complicated questions, or have we basically had a de facto ban on this kind of material even before these actual bans? And what's the difficulty of shielding the younger generation from the facts of our past?
I think that's a really good question. I know for the case of my generation, a lot of the context of the past and the present came up not very directly, but sometimes was through an English class. We did an exam and we'd hear about a dying species of a bird and we had to write an essay about it. And we weren't allowed to really engage in the topic for long periods of time. And I think that allowed for my generation specifically to feel like there was this sense that something was wrong, because we were reading so many of the texts that we were reading were about this really bad past and this really bad present and this potentially existential future. And there wasn't a real moment for us in a classroom to really engage in really concrete discussions about how we as young people play a role in really bettering the world than we come into it. And I think what is really essential is ensuring that we have really like key conversations within schools about how we can restructure education to be more collaborative with students so that they can learn from each other and learn from teachers. So it isn't just lecturing back and forth, but having a dialogue where we're able to really raise these discussions, raise these book points, where like...
Do you have an idea of what that looks like? Like in practice, what would it look like?
Yeah,
to be more collaborative.
Sometimes that could just be like a seminar where people are able to ask questions to each other and they're able to have this kind of discussion and maybe have a debate about it, like half the class takes a position, the other half doesn't. And then it can be where at the end you're able to read that book and then relate to not just how it impacts the present, but what solutions could we do in the future? And think about, well, what are you passionate about? And like really ask students a question, not just about what career field they want to go into, but about what in their heart makes them feel like they want to do good in. Do you want to advocate on behalf of animals, advocate on behalf of social justice? Like, what are those things? And really taking like kind of small groups where you're able to really dive deep into that. And I think that could be really powerful for young people. I know for myself that would have been incredibly powerful. And I think now I work within the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and we're writing recommendations specifically on this to talk about like what role does the Department of Education play in this? Like, how are they ensuring that we have a nationalized curriculum where we're updating our national kind of subjects? Where are we having climate science as a key subject? Are we having computer science as a key subject? Are we having curriculum which kind of allows our society to kind of progress alongside it so we aren't leaving them behind? Because currently our kind of structure of schooling is meant for a young person to graduate, go right into a factory job because you're used to that kind of structure of like 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. you're going to this class, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. you're going to that class. And I think we have to kind of restructure it in a way that like the books we're reading, the context in which we're going to school, and the degree of flexibility within schools can be much more adaptable to modern contexts. Because in the case of me, like I grew up, my teacher in elementary school didn't have a set curriculum about slavery. So she said that black people were indentured servants and that it really wasn't that bad for black people. And the school ended up getting shut down a few years later because so many teachers complained. And at a school 2 blocks down the road, there was a completely different curriculum where each student, it was a predominantly black school, each student got an ancient Egyptian god where they would be able to see it as like a different perspective of just like Greek goddesses. And like that was a really refreshing like kind of switch up because like you're able to see like a multipolar world where you're able to really dive deep into not just European contexts, but also contexts that are really specific to different types of ways of life.
Did you want to say something, Adam? Or?
On these book bans, or removing books from libraries, I have 2 thoughts. One, kids are reading books. That's great. Two, you're afraid they're going to read something offensive. Are you familiar with the internet?
I feel like I should confess this now. When my daughter goes to sleep at night, I go into her room and take her phone, and I go to TikTok, and I look up books so it changes her algorithm to only give her book recommendations. Don't tell. So Nina, Sherilyn Eiffel, who we mentioned earlier in the morning, she's had a lot to say about the book bans, and one of the things that she says about them is that those who are seeking to limit books and other curricular material recognize the persuasive power of being able to identify with another person's experience. That when you can identify and see and understand the other person's experience, you can empathize with them, but you can also move forward as an ally to help change what is oppressing them or what is getting in their way. And that's the thing that's feared. The fact that these books might allow us to become more cohesive, not that they are actually discomfiting. So with that in mind, it feels like the book bans have been talked about as a very siloed issue, but it's a broader question about how we all relate to each other and move in coalition. So how does a movement that is focused on advocacy take all of this together and then translate it into an approach or a strategy that tries to build those kind of coalitions and speaks to various issues, not just any one single issue?
That's a really hard question. I will observe that in Texas, while we're dealing with book bans, we also have children attending school with each other. So perhaps more powerful than a single book in terms of learning about somebody else's experience is having that child sit in the desk next to yours. So again, I am hopeful that as Texas experiences demographic change, although we also tend to be very residentially segregated, but there are many places where students of different backgrounds are sitting together in the classroom, and I'm very hopeful about that. In terms of the book bans in Texas on civil rights, I think it's very specific. So there's a banned book that I have in my office called Separate is Never Equal. It's an elementary school children's picture book. So it's meant for like 7, 8-year-olds. And it's about Mendez versus Westminster, which was the case in California brought by a Latino family that, I guess, overturned school segregation for Mexican Americans in California. Oddly, I saw yesterday in the news that there was a federal bill passed to name a courthouse in Los Angeles, federal courthouse in Los Angeles, after the Mendez family. But in this one school district in Texas, you cannot have an elementary school child read of the experience of this case and the fact that it ended segregation by law in California. So it's like it was a very weird moment when I read that last night. So in particular, what is being banned, right? Not one child learning from another about their experience, at least not yet in Texas, but the idea that this structure of segregation existed, that it was overcome, that Sylvia herself, the little girl, then ended up going to a mostly white school, and it was difficult for her at first. Those are the things that Texas doesn't want to teach, right? That's where that book, the book ban, when it touches on students of color or experiences of color, it's usually about civil rights cases or the civil rights movement.
So the history, but Mary, we've talked about this. In some of the other book bans in other parts of the country, it's not just about the teaching of complicated history, but actually the present. And there are books that are banned that feature gay or queer protagonists, and that feels like an effort to silence the expression of certain identities.
Absolutely, it's an attempt to silence. And you mentioned the term de facto earlier in terms of bans. I mean, I know there are a few states in the country where LGBTQ people are sort of acknowledged as part of the curriculum in age and pedagogically appropriate ways, but it's still the exception and it's not the rule. So it really has been about learning from your classmates and their families and seeing that and so on. But it's pointed and it teaches that, well, it's when you have no curriculum, it also says so much about your worth and your relevance and creates a vacuum where other narratives can fill the void. And these people are dangerous. These people are trying to make you something you're not. These people are trying to, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is, I just think, one part of the phenomenon. The other thing, just on the positive side, that I want to say is, and it's different when you have a state law, and we're litigating against some state laws also that effectuate curricular or library bans. And it's also true to the extent that books get challenged, often in an individual school system. Under the general rubric of the National School Boards Association, there's usually a process where it goes to the school board and they review the book after a complaint. And they talk about its genuine pedagogical value and how it may speak to a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old. And, everybody can organize. Organizing is key. And having people show up and talk and share about their experiences about why this book would be meaningful to my child. My child actually said, I read Genderqueer, and I had never seen myself in a book before, and this was the first time. Important. So anyway, I just want to say that I have been semi-encouraged that there have been plenty of local school boards in very conservative places who have kept books on shelves. And of course, I've been incredibly disheartened by like stripping shelves of tons and tons of books that just really honor and respect, you know, the diversity of all of our communities. But anyway, paths forward here. I always think there's a path forward, and organizing is definitely part of that, and continuing to speak those truths about just these are the folks in our community, everybody belongs here.
Well, it also emphasizes the importance of the local. We speak so often in terms of national or federal politics, but there are other systems in play here, the states, localities. Adam, did you want to say something? No. Well, don't worry, I have a question for you.
I was just nodding my head in agreement.
Okay. My students do that, and that never goes well for them. I always then ask a question, and I'm going to ask a question of you, Adam. You mentioned earlier Dobbs, and I think we'd be remiss on Radcliffe Day not to talk about, I think, one of the most jarring decisions that the court has issued, withdrawing a fundamental right that many American women had come to rely upon. A couple of years ago, well before Dobbs, in my constitutional law class, I asked my students, we were talking about Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the 1992 case that reaffirmed the core holding of Roe versus Wade, but substantially cut back on protections for abortion rights. And I asked my students, would it have been better for the court in 1992 to just overrule Roe versus Wade, and then perhaps there would have been some kind of mobilization around abortion rights as opposed to the incremental diminution of those rights over time? And my students were like, no, that'd be terrible. And I felt slightly vindicated after Dobbs, because when the court announced that decision, there was this groundswell. First, when the initial leaked decision came out, and then again when the official decision was announced. And we have seen enormous activism from a multi-generational coalition around the question of access to abortion and reproductive freedom. So is this encouraging? I mean, is this an example of popular constitutionalism, a kind of silver lining in what has been a very dispiriting decision?
So to start with the history of Casey, I think you're exactly right. And that was, in fact, the strategy of Planned Parenthood. They took that case to the court expecting to lose. They got up there quickly in '92. It was an election year. And they said, if we're going to lose this right, and it looked like with the composition of that court, which surprised us, they were going to lose. They wanted to lose at a politically salient moment. And a second data point is that the savviest member of the court's conservative wing, John Roberts, you'll recall in Dobbs, did not go along with the 5-justice majority, which eliminated the right entirely. He wanted to do something more of a compromise, more incremental, uphold Mississippi's 15-week ban, still a huge step, but nonetheless not one that would have sent a political earthquake through the land. And I think he was animated in part by political savvy, because he could tell that the decision that the court ultimately issued was going to mobilize people. For the longest time, it was a rote piece of conventional wisdom that, you know, if the court overrules Roe, it's going to be great for Democrats. And I'm not very smart about politics, but I heard it said so many times, I said, well, maybe there's something to it. It turns out there was a lot to it, that in returning this issue to the political branches, it empowered the people and their political representatives.
But in a limited way. So one of the things we saw immediately after the Dobbs decision was announced was a ballot referendum in Kansas, where in ruby red Kansas, people went to the ballot boxes, and when they could register their preferences for reproductive freedom directly, they did so overwhelmingly in favor of reproductive freedom. A few days later, the Indiana state legislature, a representative democracy, passed one of the most draconian abortion bans in the country. So you see the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy in action. And it is worth noting, and Nina has done a lot of work on this in the space of voting rights, that state legislatures are often among the most gerrymandered and distorted representative institutions in the country. given that there is this opportunity for galvanization and mobilization of the electorate, does it get bottlenecked in a landscape where our representative institutions are gerrymandered and distorted, and where there aren't as many avenues to directly reflect your preferences at the voting blocks?
Texas does not have initiative and referendum. On most days, I'm really glad for that.
But that's a great point, too. I mean, very often ballot initiatives have been a way for more conservative elements to advance their interests in states like California and Colorado and whatnot.
Arizona as well, with respect to anti-immigrant
Yes.
legislation. Well, we have a redistricting case pending now against Texas, and Texas has, in every decennial redistricting since 1972, been found to have discriminated against Latino voters, either by a federal court or by the Justice Department. So Texas has a long and renowned history of discriminating on the basis of race in the drawing of its district lines. And we make a little bit of progress every time. We do that redistricting-wise. We do that more demographically. And I do remain hopeful about that. But yes, there is a lot of gerrymandering that happens in the district lines. And, the only hope we really have is to increase voter turnout. Because if you increase voter turnout, a lot of the expectations that people had when they drew those lines disappear, right?
So again, you have to overwhelm the distortion with turnout.
Yes, that's a perfect way of putting it.
Right, so Jerome and Mary, as a related question, reproductive freedom is not the main issue on your agendas, but it's ancillary to certain degrees. To what extent, for both of you, does the environmental justice movement, the gay rights movement, incorporate those questions of reproductive justice and translate them for your constituencies to build coalitions among groups that are perhaps distinct in terms of their identity and generational pull?
Do you want to start? Okay. I appreciate the question. With respect to reproductive justice, I think we've been there in not the best and most fulsome way over the years, but Dobbs absolutely changed all of that. And, it's really clear that there clearly are people in our community who get pregnant and for whom this is very direct, not to have that choice. But beyond that, clearly when you start talking about taking away a fundamental right, you start talking about the incredibly pinpoint test that the court used to look backwards rather than at the present or the future for people, lots and lots of concerns there. So I would just say at this point, for us at least, I'm not sure this is true of all of the other LGBTQ organizations, but at this point, we are like really arm in arm and working on trying to make sure that people can get the care they need, that they can make the decisions about themselves, not have the government make these decisions. I mean, things we have been saying in our movement for years, but now we're saying it together. And I also just want to say, like, some of the reproductive rights groups have chapters in every state or multiple chapters in a state. So it's a level of organization that I have not experienced before at all. And so that brings a lot to the discussion. And I mentioned shield laws a minute ago. We have states, like nearly half the states now, with bans on medical care for transgender young people, even if a parent and the doctor and everybody else says this is what my child needs. And the right wing is very clear that they want to destabilize and are already beginning to limit adult care. So we're really starting to talk about this broader issue of erasure. Like, it's just not legitimate to be trans. Very concerning. But to be there in partnership with the Center for Reproductive Rights and Planned Parenthood and so many other local organizations that have developed, where we're all basically making the same points about this is for us to decide, not the government, very, very strong.
Jerome?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think especially within the work that we do, it really unites beyond a specific issue, more than the fact that we serve people who have faced discrimination in one form or another. And what the commonality between that is the fact that they have issues of economic issues, where oftentimes discrimination is because of the fact that they are black or gay or like so many different other things. And I think I was reading feminist literature a little while ago, and I was really reading a key passage where they said that the women's rights movement was really successful because that it wasn't just fighting for the rights of white women, but it was fighting for the rights of trans women as well. It was fighting for the rights of every single woman, so that when you're inevitably successful and the moral arc of justice is bent to morality, everyone has access to justice, and not just the kind of focus of a particular group, but that everyone, the people who are most marginalized and you can kind of measure that by the different compounding intersections of discrimination, whether if they're trans and they're black and they're gay and all these different things that they can compound them, and if you're advocating for that, then you're advocating for everyone. And I think that's why we're so passionate about abortion rights and the fact of like book bans and all these different societal issues, because if we're attacking it at the root is the fact that our democracy is not representing people. And it's not representing the fact that everyone has kind of changed their mind. They've kind of woken up to the rights that are needed.
So I'm getting the cues that we are winding down on time. So let me pose a broad question to maybe wind things up for the panel. I will note that in June, our honoree will have a milestone birthday. So happy early birthday, Justice. Maybe I wasn't supposed to tell. She has often said that she was born just a month after the United States Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education on May 17th in 1954. Brown is invoked constantly by the Supreme Court, Adam. It was invoked in Dobbs for the view that Dobbs was like Brown, reversing a discredited decision and setting the country on the right course. It was recently invoked in the South Carolina voting rights case that was announced yesterday. Are we living up to the promise of Brown right now and the possibilities of an equal, integrated society with education at its center as a crucible for the formation of good citizens?
Well, so your question kind of answers itself.
It does that.
But it's a funny thing about it. Everyone wants to claim the mantle of Brown, and the Dobbs decision did say that Brown had overruled an earlier precedent, but it did it in the direction of equality, and it did it notably unanimously. It didn't do it in an ideologically divided way. I saw a couple of weeks ago Justice Brett Kavanaugh make some remarks at the Fifth Circuit Judicial Conference in Austin, and he made this point, but I'm not sure it's right. He said, you know, a lot of those Warren Court decisions very unpopular at the time, including Brown, and it's true, Brown was deeply unpopular in the South. But over time, people recognized them as integral to the fabric of American law. And his suggestion, not explicit but unmistakable, was that Dobbs, also unpopular now, but will later become accepted as one of the court's greatest hits, and time will tell.
Nina?
All right, so I've tried to be positive, but the answer to this one is no. We're not living up to it. And I think what it means for all of us here is that we do have to center education within the struggle towards equality and equal treatment. This is that time. As much as people have made efforts to kind of separate kids out, public education is still that time where the children are gathered together. And when it's an integrated setting, this is where children form some of their most important relationships with their peers. The amount of diversity in the classroom, what's being taught in the classroom, the way that Jerome was describing empowering students to use their critical thinking skills, to engage in their curriculum truly. We are facing efforts contrary to all of that. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to push towards that goal of Brown, and to focus particularly on education. We know that the higher level of education you achieve, the more likely you are to vote, because I have to talk about voting all the time. But it really does start with education, right, and your experience in education.
Mary? Jerome?
Yeah, I think that especially when it comes to education, I feel like my generation has got to the point where we're educating ourselves. Like, we're all across, like you see on Instagram, social media, we're really understanding that if our education system is not going to equip us with the necessary needs to be adults, and we're going to show each other what that looks like. And on the podcast that I founded, A World Upside Down, which I didn't know the context that would become, we started that. We started like interviewing young people, and what they said is that education really has to transform, which we are ahead of the curve, and that we are showing young people possibilities that they don't even think of, and that we invite stakeholders which typically aren't involved within kind of traditional education, like involving virtuality, for example, or thinking about how you can have school trips in museums and having museums and classrooms be hybrids, where we've seen in the case of, there's an initiative called XQ Super School America, where they had 10 different schools across the US, like come with different initiatives about education. And they thought about how can we think about and reframe high school and middle school and elementary school. And what they saw is that like education doesn't have to be this one specific thing that's standardized across the country, because each young person is different and unique. And we have to kind of tailor that to how we teach young people.
You know, we're in a group here where everybody understands the value of education, and, you know, based on research, it's really clear people across the generations value education for a way for people to come to be prepared to live in our society and take their place as adults and have a good life. And I just want to add to that, you know, for all of these efforts to restrict and censor and so on, I want to just lift up that Governor Ron DeSantis had to settle the cases involving the Don't Say Gay or Trans law. He had to turn it around and say, you do get to be who you are. Yeah, okay, we have to let some of this material in the classroom. And I want to say, like I have found in my own life, you lose a lot before you win. So I think we have to hang in there for education. We have to make higher education affordable for people. We need to make sure that the president continues to do, whatever president, they do all they can to make sure that there is debt relief and they can work their way around this idea from the Supreme Court that it's a major question to resolve debt relief. So I would just want to say education remains vital for all of us and for our society going forward.
This is the lightning wind-up round. One sentence of hope to give this audience and all of us as we go forth on this Radcliffe Day. So one sentence to wrap everything up, and a message of hope and promise to launch the rest of the day. So I started with you, Nina, so I'm not going to start with you now. Jerome.
One sentence, okay, let's see. I would say to everyone here to know that you have so much power, you have so many avenues to create change, and that this is the opportunity, this is the window in time that we can really use all the access, all of the ability for us to be able to use our phones, use the networks that we have to really advocate for change in a way that we've never seen before, and to not be afraid to be radical, not be afraid to raise those uncomfortable conversations and say, maybe let's rethink the fundamentals of how we're thinking about the problem and go about it a whole different way. And if we do that, we can for sure change the world. We have to be brave enough, we have to be bold enough to do it.
Adam?
My sentence of hope is that people like Jerome give me hope.
Thank you. I'm all about engagement, because with engagement, you bridge divides, you find that common ground, and you will find a path forward. So please stay engaged.
So following on some of the greatest blessings in my life, which have been the young people who have passed through my home, I encourage all of you to find 10 individuals aged 18 to 25 and ask them, what can I do for you?
Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel for such an inspiring conversation. I hope you all enjoy the rest of Radcliffe Day.
Thank you. I want to thank Melissa and all of our panelists for such an illuminating and an engaging discussion. We'll now break for lunch and we'll reconvene at 11:55 for our afternoon session in honor of Justice Sotomayor.